The date was February 12th, 1988. The location was the Black Sea, a body of water that the Soviet Union viewed not merely as a maritime border, but as a steel-gated courtyard to its own home. For decades, this sea had been a sanctuary for the Red Navy, a place where the hammer and sickle flew undisputed. The water here was freezing, the winds were biting, and the geopolitical tension was thicker than the heavy fog that often rolled off the Crimean coast. On the bridge of the Soviet frigate Bezovetny, Commander Vladimir Bogdashin stood watching the radar screen with a growing sense of unease that was rapidly evolving into disbelief. He was a seasoned officer, a man trained in the rigid, paranoid discipline of the Soviet naval doctrine. He knew the rules, he knew the lines on the map that Moscow had drawn in red ink, and he knew that no one, absolutely no one, crossed those lines without permission. But the radar blip in front of him was not asking for permission. 2 American warships were steaming northbound, cutting through the grey chop of the Black Sea with an almost arrogant steadiness. They were not drifting, they were not lost. They were moving with precision toward the 12-mile limit that marked the sovereign territory of the USSR. To the crew of the Bezovetny, this made no sense. This was not the open Atlantic, where the 2 superpowers played cat and mouse in the deep ocean. This was the doorstep of Sevastopol, the headquarters of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. For an American task force to push this close was not just a provocation, it was an impossibility. It was suicidal. The Soviet coastal defense batteries, the air regiments stationed in Crimea, and the entire might of the Black Sea Fleet were within striking distance. Commander Bogdashin raised his binoculars. Through the mist, the silhouette of the lead American vessel began to take shape. It was a terrifying sight. It was the USS Yorktown. This was not just any ship. The Yorktown was a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, a floating fortress of American high technology. It was fitted with the Aegis Combat System, a computerized network capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously and guiding missiles to destroy them with pinpoint accuracy. To the Soviet sailors looking through their viewfinders, the Yorktown looked like a spaceship that had landed in the water. It was massive, blocky, and bristling with phased array radar panels that looked like unblinking eyes. Trailing behind it was the USS Caron, a Spruance-class destroyer, smaller but heavily armed and packed with electronic surveillance gear. The confusion on the Soviet bridge was palpable. Why were they doing this? In the 1980s, the rules of the Cold War were usually understood by both sides. You shadowed each other, you watched, but you stayed in international waters. To cross the 12-mile line was an act of war. It was an invasion of sovereign territory. Bogdashin grabbed the radio handset. His voice was steady, but the tension in the room was electric. He broadcast a warning on the international frequency, his words recorded in history books and naval archives as the prelude to madness. Channel 16. Soviet ship to United States ship. You are approaching Soviet territorial waters. I have orders to expel you. Over. The response from the Yorktown was immediate, calm, and infuriatingly robotic. It came in English, crisp and devoid of fear. This is United States warship Yorktown. I am engaged in innocent passage consistent with international law. I will not change course. Innocent passage? The phrase hung in the air on the Soviet bridge like a bad joke. There was nothing innocent about a 9,000-ton cruiser equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles entering the backyard of the Soviet Union. Bogdashin looked at his political officer. He looked at his helmsman. They were waiting for orders. But the orders from Fleet Command were a riddle wrapped in a paradox. Moscow had been clear. Stop them. Do not let them violate the border. But also, do not fire. Do not start World War III. How do you stop a moving fortress without shooting at it? The distance between the ships closed. The Yorktown crossed the line. The alarm klaxons on the Bezovetny began to scream. They were now inside Soviet waters. The Americans were effectively invading the USSR. Commander Bogdashin realized he was witnessing something that defied all Soviet logic. The Americans were not maneuvering. They were not readying weapons. They were simply sailing, straight and true, ignoring the frantic Russian warships buzzing around them like angry wasps. It was a display of discipline that was unnerving. If the Americans were scared, they didn't show it. If they were preparing for a fight, their decks were clear. It was a ghost ship behavior. They were acting as if the Soviet Navy didn't exist. If you are enjoying this deep dive into Cold War history, please subscribe to the Cold War Impact channel. We uncover the classified stories that shaped our world. The stakes in this moment were apocalyptic. This was 1988. The Cold War was supposed to be thawing. Gorbachev was in power. Treaties were being signed. But here, on the freezing water, the old hatreds were boiling over. If Bogdashin fired a missile, the Yorktown would likely shoot it down with its Aegis system and then retaliate with harpoon missiles that would turn the Bezovetny into a burning wreck within seconds. Then, the Soviet Air Force would launch from Crimea. The US Sixth Fleet would scramble fighters from the Mediterranean. Tactical nuclear weapons were standard loadouts on many of these vessels. A single spark could turn the Black Sea into a radioactive crater. But the Yorktown kept coming. 10 miles from the coast. 9 miles. Bogdashin made a decision that would horrify his superiors and stun the world. If he couldn't shoot them, he would hit them. Physically. He ordered his ship to increase speed. The Bezovetny was a Krivak-class frigate, weighing about 3,000 tons. The Yorktown displaced nearly 10,000 tons. It was a compact car trying to run a semi-truck off the road. The physics were impossible. The logic was insane. "Stand by for collision," Bogdashin roared over the intercom. The Soviet sailors braced themselves against bulkheads, their knuckles white. They watched the grey steel wall of the Yorktown grow larger and larger in the portholes until it blocked out the sky. The Americans on the deck of the cruiser began to run, realizing too late that the Soviet ship wasn't turning away. The impact was not a clean slice. It was a grinding, chaotic crash. The Bezovetny surged forward, its bow slamming into the port side of the American cruiser. The sound was deafening, the shriek of tearing metal, the groan of structural steel being forced past its limit. Sparks showered down like fireworks. The Soviet ship was thrown sideways by the sheer mass of the American cruiser. But Bogdashin didn't back off. He ordered the helm hard over, keeping the pressure on, grinding his ship against the Yorktown like a wild animal trying to take down prey. Then, something even more terrifying happened. The Bezovetny's starboard anchor, hanging loose at the bow, caught on the Yorktown's superstructure. The massive steel hook tore through the American ship's hull plating, ripping open the skin of the cruiser. As the ships rolled in the heavy swell, the Bezovetny's bow climbed up onto the Yorktown's flight deck. For a few seconds, the Soviet frigate was literally riding on top of the American cruiser. The Soviet tail section swung violently, and the Bezovetny's missile launcher smashed into the Yorktown's harpoon launchers. Metal sheared. Fire broke out on the American deck. On the bridge of the Bezovetny, it was chaos. Men were thrown to the floor. The ship shuddered as if it had hit a reef. But as the ships finally separated, drifting apart in the churning white water, Bogdashin and his crew looked at the Yorktown with breathless anticipation. They expected the American ship to stop. They expected the Americans to sound general quarters, to turn their guns, to demand an apology, or to retreat. They expected the shock of the collision to break the American resolve. Instead, they saw the impossible. The Yorktown did not stop. It did not slow down. The American cruiser, scarred, dented and smoking, simply corrected its course and continued steaming deeper into Soviet waters. The radio crackled again. The voice was the same, calm, unshaken. "This is United States warship Yorktown. I am continuing my passage." A chill went down the spines of the Soviet officers that had nothing to do with the freezing wind. They had just rammed a US cruiser. They had risked hull breach and sinking. They had risked nuclear war. And the Americans had barely blinked. What were they dealing with? This wasn't just a border violation. This was a message. But what was the message? And why were the Americans so confident that the Soviet Union, a superpower with the largest navy in the world by hull count, would do absolutely nothing to stop them? Behind the Yorktown, the USS Caron was also being rammed by the smaller Soviet frigate SKR-6. It was a melee of steel and ocean. Yet, the formation held. The Americans pushed forward, deeper into the red zone. Bogdashin realized then that his radar screens were lying to him. They showed 2 ships. But what was really happening was a display of something invisible, a doctrine, a technology, or a strategy that the Soviets could not see and did not understand. As the Yorktown faded slightly into the mist, still moving, still broadcasting its calm message of innocent passage, the Soviet command center in Sevastopol was in an uproar. Generals were shouting into telephones. Radar operators were tracking the intrusion with trembling hands. They had thrown their best ships at the intruders. They had played the ultimate game of chicken with live warships, and they had lost. The mystery that gripped the Soviet Admiralty that afternoon was profound. It wasn't just about the damage to the ships. It was the psychological devastation. The Americans had walked through the front door, taken a punch to the face, and kept walking. What did the Americans know that the Soviets didn't? What gave them this godlike confidence? Was it the Aegis system? Was it some new electronic warfare capability that jammed the Soviet decision-making loop? Or was it something far more dangerous, a fundamental shift in the balance of power that Moscow had failed to detect? The Bezovetny limped back toward port, its bow crushed, its paint stripped away. But the real damage was invisible. The Soviet Navy had just blinked. And in the cold calculus of the 1980s, blinking was the first step toward dying. Back at headquarters, the investigation began immediately. The KGB wanted answers. The Admiralty wanted heads to roll. They needed to understand why the American ships were untouchable. They needed to understand the source of this terrifying arrogance. They began to scour their intelligence reports, looking for the ghost in the machine, the secret weapon that allowed a US captain to treat a Soviet destroyer like a minor annoyance. They would spend months analyzing the incident. They would look at the radar tapes. They would interview the sailors. But they were looking in the wrong direction. They were looking for a gadget, a new missile, or a secret order. They didn't realize that the answer wasn't on the Yorktown. The answer was in the very foundation of the system they were trying to defend. The Bezovetny limped back into the harbor of Sevastopol under a shroud of silence that was heavier than the damage to its hull. When a Soviet warship returns from a mission, there is usually fanfare, a band on the pier, and the rigid choreography of naval tradition. But on the evening of February 12, 1988, there was only the stark glare of floodlights and the hurried footsteps of high-ranking officers rushing toward the gangway. The frigate looked like it had been in a street fight. Its paint was scraped away in long, jagged scars of raw steel. The missile launcher was twisted. The railings were crushed. To the casual observer, it looked like a wreck. But to the grim-faced men of the Soviet Admiralty who boarded the ship that night, the physical damage was irrelevant. Steel could be fixed. Paint could be reapplied. What they needed to fix was the hole that had just been punched in their reality. Commander Bogdashin was not greeted as a hero immediately. He was greeted as a suspect. He was whisked away to a debriefing room that smelled of stale tobacco and wet wool, where a panel of admirals and KGB liaisons waited. The atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of frantic, terrified investigation. They didn't ask him if he was hurt. They didn't ask about the crew. They asked the question that would haunt the Soviet Naval Command for the next decade. Why didn't they turn? The interrogation went on for hours. The Soviets played back the audio tapes of the radio exchange. They listened to the American voice, over and over again. "I am engaged in innocent passage." The tone was flat, emotionless. It didn't sound like a captain under duress. It sounded like a machine. The KGB analysts dissected the voice stress. Was the American captain bluffing? Was he drunk? Was he insane? "They acted," Bogdashin reported, his voice raspy from shouting commands, "as if we were not a threat. I rammed a 10,000-ton cruiser. I tore a hole in their side. And they just kept going." This was the detail that kept the admirals awake that night. In the Soviet tactical doctrine, force was met with counterforce. If you punch someone, they punch back, or they cover up. The USS Yorktown had done neither. It had simply absorbed the violence and continued its mission. This led to the first wrong conclusion, a theory that spread through the Black Sea Fleet like a virus. The Soviet analysts became convinced that the Yorktown was a bait ship. The theory went like this. The Americans wanted the Bezovetny to fire. They were trying to provoke a first-shot scenario. The analysts argued that the Yorktown must have had its finger on a trigger that the Soviets couldn't see. If Bogdashin had launched a single missile, the theory went, the Yorktown would have unleashed a hellstorm of technology that would have wiped out the entire Black Sea coastal defense grid in minutes. They believed they had narrowly avoided a trap. This paranoia kicked off a massive, frantic scramble across the Soviet military intelligence apparatus. They needed to know what was on that ship. Intelligence officers began scouring every photo taken during the collision. Sailors on the Bezovetny had snapped pictures of the Yorktown's deck from just a few meters away. These photos were developed in darkrooms with armed guards standing outside. They were blown up to massive sizes and pinned to corkboards in Moscow. What they saw terrified them. The Yorktown didn't look like a normal ship. It lacked the spinning, rotating radar dishes that defined naval warfare since the 1940s. Instead, it had massive, flat, octagonal plates bolted to the superstructure. They looked like concrete slabs. To the uninitiated, it looked inert. But the Soviet scientists knew what they were looking at, and it chilled them to the bone. This was the AN divided by SPY-1 radar system, the heart of the Aegis combat system. The reports that landed on the desks of the Kremlin were filled with technical jargon that amounted to a ghost story. They described a radar that didn't need to spin, a radar that could see in all directions at once, instantly, a radar that could track over 100 targets, missiles, jets, surface ships simultaneously, and guide 18 missiles to intercept them all at the same time. The Soviets had nothing like this. Their radars were mechanical. They had blind spots every time the dish turned away. The Yorktown had no blind spots. It was an all-seeing eye. This technological gap morphed into a legendary status. The Soviet naval officers began to whisper that the Yorktown was essentially a robot. Rumors flew that the ship was fully automated, that the crew were just passengers, and that a computer in Washington was steering the vessel. This explained the soulless voice on the radio. It explained the lack of fear. You cannot scare a microchip. As the weeks passed, the investigation deepened. The Soviets deployed their own Ferret aircraft reconnaissance planes packed with sensors to try and provoke the Yorktown again, from a distance, just to see how its electronic brain reacted. They flew MiG-25 aircraft toward the American fleet, waiting for the American radar to light them up. Usually, when a Soviet jet approaches a US ship, the US ship turns on its fire control radar to lock on. It's a warning, an electronic growl. But the Yorktown didn't growl. The pilots reported that their radar warning receivers remained silent. The American ship was tracking them, they knew it was, but it was doing it so subtly, with such advanced passive sensors and phased array beams, that the Soviet pilots couldn't even tell they were being watched. This was the ultimate nightmare for a fighter pilot, to be in the crosshairs of a gun you cannot see. The paranoia reached the highest levels of the Politburo. A secret committee was formed to analyze the Black Sea incident. Their conclusion was bleak. They determined that the Americans were no longer playing by the rules of conventional warfare. The Soviets had spent the 1970s and 80s building a massive navy. They had built more submarines, more destroyers, and more cruisers than the Americans. They focused on hull count. They focused on tonnage. They believed that quantity had a quality all its own. But the investigation into the collision revealed that their quantity was irrelevant. One report, buried in the archives for years, stated, "The American vessel displayed a confidence that suggests they possess a defensive capability we cannot penetrate. They did not fear our ramming because they knew we could not sink them with weapons." This was the wrong conclusion, of course. The Yorktown was not unsinkable. If Bogdashin had fired a heavy anti-ship missile at point-blank range, the Yorktown would have burned. But the Soviets were so mesmerized by the mystery of the American behavior that they attributed magical powers to the enemy. They psyched themselves out. They began to see ghosts everywhere. Every American ship that crossed the horizon was now suspected of carrying this invincible technology. The bogeyman was no longer a specific weapon, it was the entire American command and control network. The investigators also obsessed over the political dimension. Why did the Americans choose February 1988? They spun wild theories. Some analysts claimed it was a signal related to the upcoming summits. Others claimed it was a distraction to cover a covert insertion of Navy SEALs onto the Crimean coast. They wasted thousands of man-hours searching the beaches for footprints that didn't exist. They were looking for a complex Machiavellian plot. They were looking for a conspiracy. They couldn't grasp the simple, terrifying truth. The Americans had done it just because they could. The investigation culminated in a strange paralysis. The Soviet Navy became more aggressive in its rhetoric, but more cautious in its actions. They were afraid to push the Americans too far, terrified that they would trigger the trap they believed the Yorktown represented. By focusing on the mystery of the trap, they missed the real threat. They were so busy analyzing the dents in the Yorktown's hull and the tone of the captain's voice that they failed to look at what was happening inside the laboratories of the United States. They failed to see that the Yorktown was just the tip of the spear. While the Soviets were holding emergency meetings in Sevastopol, trying to figure out why a US captain would play chicken with a destroyer, a group of engineers and strategists thousands of miles away were already moving on to the next phase. The Soviets were hunting for a secret order or a hidden missile. But the real secret wasn't on the ship. The real secret was a fundamental shift in how the West viewed the ocean itself. The Soviets saw the sea as territory to be fenced off. The Americans saw it as a global highway that they owned. and to enforce ownership of that highway, the Americans had built something that made the Soviet obsession with hull count look like a strategy from the 19th century. While the Soviet Admiralty was paralyzed by ghosts, chasing theories of bait ships and secret traps in the smoky briefing rooms of Sevastopol, the reality was far calmer and far more clinical. 3,000 miles away, inside the windowless vaults of the Pentagon and on the quiet, air-conditioned bridge of the USS Yorktown, there was no confusion, there was no panic, there was only math. The ghost that the Soviets were hunting wasn't magic, it was a program. Specifically, it was the Aegis combat system. To understand why the American captain, Commander Philip Durr, could watch a Soviet frigate barrel toward him and not flinch, you have to understand what he was standing inside. The Yorktown was not just a ship with guns, it was the first true computer of the high seas. The Soviets were still fighting World War II in their minds. Their doctrine relied on saturation, launch enough missiles, send enough planes, and eventually, one will get through. It was a strategy of brute force. The American solution to this was not to build thicker armor, it was to build a faster brain. Decades prior, the US Navy realized that human reflexes were no longer fast enough to stop supersonic anti-ship missiles. A human radar operator takes seconds to see a blip, seconds to identify it, and seconds to assign a weapon. In modern warfare, those seconds are the difference between life and death. So, American engineers created Aegis. Inside the Combat Information Center, CIC, of the Yorktown, deep within the ship, sailors sat in front of large blue monitors in a room bathed in blue light. It looked more like the control room of NASA than a warship. At the heart of this system was the AN divided by Spy-1 radar. Unlike the spinning dishes on the Bezovetny that swept the horizon every few seconds, the SPY-1 used 4 fixed hexagonal plates to send out beams of electromagnetic energy electronically. It didn't spin. It stared. It stared in all directions, all the time. This was the technological leap that gave the Americans their godlike confidence. The Yorktown's computer could track hundreds of targets simultaneously from the wavetops to the stratosphere and calculate the threat level of each one instantly. When the Bezovetny and the SKR-6 were swarming around them, the Soviet captains were sweating, shouting orders, and wrestling with the helm. On the Yorktown, the computer had already calculated the speed, trajectory, and potential threat of the Soviet ships. It had already solutioned firing paths for the Harpoon missiles. It had already prioritized the threats. The American crew wasn't calm because they were reckless. They were calm because they had situational omnipotence. They knew exactly what the Soviets were doing before the Soviets even did it. But the technological dominance was only half the story. The other half of the mystery, the reason why they were there, was a secret project of a different kind. It wasn't a weapon system, it was a legal weapon. It was called the Freedom of Navigation, FON program. In the late 1970s and 80s, the US State Department and the Pentagon realized that the Soviet Union was slowly trying to close off the world's oceans. The Soviets were drawing lines on maps, claiming international waters as their own historic bays. If left unchecked, the Black Sea would become a Soviet lake. The American response was a masterstroke of geopolitical theater. They wouldn't send a diplomat to argue in the UN. They would send a 9,600-ton warship to simply drive through it. The mission of the Yorktown and the Charon was not to start a war. It was to prove a point. It was a physical assertion of right. The specific ingenuity of this operation lay in its calculated restraint. The orders given to Captain Durr were incredibly complex. He had to be aggressive enough to enter Soviet waters, but disciplined enough not to fire the first shot. He had to be a diplomat in a warship. This required a level of crew training that the Soviets couldn't comprehend. On a Soviet ship, initiative was punished. Sailors did what they were told. On the Yorktown, every officer understood the rules of engagement down to the letter. They knew that if they fired first, they lost the political war. But if they stood their ground and let the Soviets hit them, they won the moral victory. The collision was not a failure of the mission. It was the validation of it. When the Bezovetny slammed into the Yorktown, the American crew didn't scramble to battle stations in a panic. They had prepared for this. They had collision bills ready. Damage control teams were standing by with shoring timber and fire hoses before the impact even occurred. While Commander Bogdashin was screaming, "Stand by for collision," the Americans were calmly notifying the National Command Authority via satellite link. "We are being bumped. Maintaining course." This was the secret the Soviets were looking for. It wasn't a trap, it was professionalism. The Americans had turned the erratic, emotional, high-stakes game of the Cold War into a disciplined procedure. They had taken the human error out of the loop. The Yorktown was a machine operated by professionals, executing a legal maneuver. The Bezovetny was a terrified animal, lashing out in confusion. The contrast was the ultimate weapon. As the ships separated and the Yorktown continued on its course, the American captain knew something the Soviet admirals didn't. He knew that by ramming him, the Soviets had just broadcast their own weakness to the world. They had proven that they couldn't stop the US Navy with intimidation. They had proven that they couldn't stop the US Navy with laws, and they had proven that they were too afraid to use real weapons. The Yorktown's damage the scraped paint, the bent launchers was a badge of honor. It was physical proof that the US could go anywhere, anytime, and the Soviet Union, for all its missiles and bluster, could do nothing but scratch the paint. The American source of power wasn't just the Aegis radar or the Harpoon missiles. It was the audacious belief that the ocean belonged to everyone, and the sheer industrial and training capability to back that belief up against a nuclear superpower. The Soviets were investigating a mystery. The Americans were simply executing a plan, but the real shock was yet to come. The Soviets thought this was just a border dispute. They didn't realize that the Yorktown's journey was exposing a much deeper rot inside their own military, a rot that would be fully revealed only when the dust settled and the shock of the incident truly hit home. The true horror of the incident didn't hit the Soviet high command until weeks later. It arrived not in the form of a missile strike or a declaration of war, but in a classified intelligence assessment that landed on the desk of the commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, Admiral Vladimir Chernovin. For days, the Soviet press had been trying to spin the collision as a victory. Pravda ran stories about the heroic crew of the Bezovetny who had repelled the violators. Medals were discussed. There was a superficial sense of triumph. The small Soviet ship had bullied the big American cruiser, but inside the Kremlin's secure briefing rooms the mood was funereal. The investigation into the mystery of the Yorktown's behavior had finally yielded a conclusion, and it was devastating. The shock came when Soviet electronic warfare specialists analyzed what had actually happened during those tense minutes of the collision. They realized that while Commander Bogdashin was screaming orders and his crew was bracing for impact, the Yorktown was doing something else entirely. The Yorktown was listening. When the Bezovetny attacked, the entire Soviet Black Sea defense network had panicked. Coastal radar stations lit up. Surface-to-air missile batteries in Crimea went to high alert. Fighter jets scrambled, turning on their fire control radars. Communications skyrocketed across every military frequency. In their desperation to stop two ships, the Soviets had turned on the lights in their entire house. And the Yorktown, with its massive AN, divided by SPY, one-phased arrays and sophisticated electronic warfare suites, had sucked it all in. This was the reveal. The Americans hadn't just conducted a freedom of navigation exercise. They had conducted one of the most successful intelligence-gathering operations of the Cold War, and they had tricked the Soviets into helping them do it. By playing chicken and refusing to turn away, the Americans had forced the Soviets to reveal their reaction times, their radar frequencies, their command hierarchies, and their communication codes. The Yorktown hadn't fired a shot, but it had effectively mapped the electronic nervous system of the Black Sea Fleet. The Soviet admirals stared at the report in disbelief. They had thought they were punishing the Americans. Instead, they had just handed the Pentagon the blueprints to their defenses. The realization was nauseating. The impossible confidence of the American captain made perfect sense now. He wasn't suicidal. He was a collection agent. Every minute he stayed in those waters, every time the Soviet ships maneuvered closer, the Yorktown's computers were filling up with priceless data. The ramming itself? To the Americans, it was likely just a data point, a stress test. The Soviet response to this realization was a mix of fury and futility. They tried to double down. They issued stern diplomatic protests. They threatened that future intrusions would be met with live fire. They expedited the development of their own advanced systems, trying to clone the capabilities of the Aegis radar. But it was too late. The psychological damage was done. The mystery of the American ghost ship was solved, but the solution was worse than the mystery. The Soviets realized they were fighting an enemy that operated on a completely different level of warfare. The Soviets were fighting for territory and pride. The Americans were fighting for information and dominance. The futility of their position was best summarized by the fate of the ships involved. The Bezovetny spent months in repair. It became a symbol of a hollow victory, a ship that had broken itself to scratch an enemy that didn't care. Meanwhile, the Yorktown was patched up in a matter of weeks and returned to service, its sensors now fine-tuned with the exact electronic fingerprints of the Soviet Navy. The Soviets tried to upgrade their fleet. They rushed the construction of their own heavy cruisers. They tried to deploy the Kuznetsov aircraft carrier to show they still had power. But these were desperate, expensive gestures from a dying empire. They couldn't innovate fast enough to catch up to the software advantage the Americans had demonstrated. They could build big ships, but they couldn't build the brain that the Yorktown possessed. The collision in the Black Sea became a metaphor for the entire end stage of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, like the Bezovetny, was heavy, aggressive, and willing to damage itself to hold the line. The United States, like the Yorktown, was technologically superior, economically resilient, and focused on the long game. The shock wasn't that the Americans were stronger, it was that the Americans were smarter. They had turned a Soviet act of aggression into an American intelligence coup. And the Soviet admirals, sitting in their offices in Moscow, looked at the photos of the dented Yorktown sailing away and realized the terrifying truth. The Americans hadn't retreated. They had simply finished their work and left. The collision in the Black Sea on February 12, 1988, was the high water mark of the Soviet Navy. It was the moment where their physical aggression peaked, only to break against the hull of a superior reality. The verdict on who won the bumping incident was delivered not by a court, but by history, and the judgment was swift. Just 3 years later, the empire that the Bezovetny had rammed a US cruiser to defend ceased to exist. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin, and the Black Sea Fleet, once the terror of the Mediterranean, became a rusting collection of assets squabbled over by newly independent nations. The killer statistic that defines this victory is not a casualty count, but a timeline of survival. The USS Yorktown, the ship the Soviets thought they had bullied, went on to serve the United States Navy for another 16 years. Its Aegis system became the gold standard of naval warfare, eventually being installed on over 100 American and Allied warships. The technology that baffled the Soviet admirals in 1988 is still the primary air defense system for the Western world today. The Bezovetny? Its fate was far more tragic and far more symbolic. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ship that had charged a Ticonderoga-class cruiser was caught in the chaotic divorce between Russia and Ukraine. It sat rotting at a pier, stripped of its glory. In 1997, it was renamed the Dnipropetrovsk and served briefly in the Ukrainian Navy, but it was a ghost of its former self. It lacked the funds, the fuel, and the purpose to sail. Eventually, it was decommissioned. In a final poetic twist of irony, the ship was sold for scrap. In 2005, while being towed to a scrapyard in Turkey, the Bezovetny, the ship named Selfless, broke its towline in a storm and sank to the bottom of the Black Sea. The aggressor lies at the bottom of the ocean it tried to close off. The defender's technology still rules the waves. This divergence illuminates the macro theme of the Cold War's finale, the failure of hardware against software. The Soviet Union spent the Cold War obsessed with the tangible. They built the biggest submarines, the Typhoon, the fastest interceptors, the MiG-25, and the most missiles. They believed that if they could just build more steel than the Americans, they would win. The Black Sea incident exposed the flaw in that thinking. The Bezovetny was a masterclass in steel. It was tough, rugged, and dangerous. But it was dumb. It was a sledgehammer trying to smash a microchip. The United States had pivoted to a war of information. The Yorktown wasn't just a ship, it was a node in a network. It represented a military-industrial complex that valued processing power, data integration, and autonomy. The Soviets could copy the shape of the ship. They could build a hull that looked like a cruiser, but they couldn't copy the culture of innovation that created the Aegis system. They couldn't copy the decentralized command structure that allowed a US captain to make split-second decisions without calling Moscow. The incident proved that the Soviet system had reached its limit. They could no longer compete with Western innovation, they could only try to physically obstruct it. And as Commander Bogdashin found out, obstructing the future is a great way to get run over. The legacy of the incident resonates even today. The freedom of navigation operations that the US Navy conducts in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait are the direct descendants of the Yorktown's mission. The script for these encounters was written in 1988. The US sails through. The opposing power screams, threatens, and maneuvers. But ultimately, the US proves that international waters are open to all. The Yorktown taught the world that a superpower doesn't need to fire a shot to prove its dominance, it just needs to hold its course. In the end, the mystery of the Black Sea wasn't a mystery at all. It was a prophecy. When the Bezevetni slammed into the Yorktown, it was the sound of the old world crashing into the new. The old world crumbled, sinking into the grey waters of history. The new world repaired the scratch, updated its software, and sailed on. The Cold War didn't end with a bang. It ended with a bump. A bump that proved once and for all that while the Soviets could dominate the map, the Americans had already mastered the reality.